Okay, you are back one more time for more on the theory of reasoned action, and really this lecture is very pointedly about information that just applies to the theory of planned behavior. In our series, this is part 4. It is the last part. You're welcome. So we're talking now really about the theory of planned behavior. So very quickly to review, we're adding in here is perceived behavioral control. So the theory of planned behavior versus the theory of reasoned action looks at attitudes and subjective norms, just as the theory of reasoned action did, or TRA, just as it did. And it adds in this notion of perceived behavioral control, which we often call PBC. As you're going to hear me refer to it often in this lecture, is PBC for perceived behavioral control. So, PBC, told you. Just like normative beliefs and attitudes, we're looking at two elements, and we put those two together to give us a number that really is what we're interested in. So the first element we're looking at are control beliefs. And control beliefs for given behavior are things that are external to us. And they're the things that are external to us that either facilitate or help us do something, or inhibit or keep us from doing something. So a person persisting through school, an external factor might be something like family financial support, right? That's something that's outside of you, it's external to you. Other people perhaps giving you money or in some way financially supporting your education, maybe helping to pay rent or something like that, right? That support is either there and will either help you, or lack of support is probably not going to help you, right? And there are other things as well. Being able to get time off from work as an external, we'd see that as external to us, right? So the work hours, that having to work more hours would inhibit, having to work fewer hours would facilitate finishing a college degree. So blank makes it possible for me to do it, right? So if we're talking about staying in school, family support, actually family emotional support makes it possible for me to do it, right? Or, of course, if family is not emotionally supporting you, they keep questioning what you're doing, that's going to inhibit you completing your degree. But that's external to you. You can't control it, but there's a matter of how much do you think it's impacting you, right? So how much, so blank makes it possible for me to do it. My family's emotional support, family financial support, the hours I have to work at school make it possible for me to do it or not possible to do it, -3 to +3. And then we're also looking at perceived power. So perceived power is internal. It's about our own ability. So control beliefs are the things that are outside of us, the things we don't believe we can control. And perceived power has to do with the things that we believe that we can control. And things that we feel we can control or not control will even apply to issues of, say, addiction, right? And so smoking, right, tobacco, or all sorts of tobacco products, chew, we'll say, creates an addiction. Do we feel we're able to overcome our addiction? Is it with something that we think is within our control? Do we think we have the power to do it? Right? So I know how to do it, or I know I can do it. That's going to be scaled from a 1 to a 7. Right? And just as before, you're going to multiply those scores by each other. That's going to give us an individual component. We're going to sum them all together. So just as with attitudes and subjective norms, let's look at how you'd go about measuring this. And before I get into actually the survey items we'd use, I want to take a second to talk about PBC and how it relates to theory of reasoned action, sort of the bigger picture about why does this matter so much? Because in the research, using the theory of planned behavior, we know that PBC is hugely important. So what is the difference then of PBC from attitudes and subjective norms? Well, let's look at the example, say, of eating organic foods. So I think it's great to do it, you'll say, right? That would be your attitude. You think it's a great thing to do. There's lots of good health effects. It protects you from bad things, right? So eating organic food is great to do. Everyone I trust tells me I should do it, right? My family would like to see me do it. My friends would like to see me do it. Health professionals would like to see me do it. That's a subjective norm. But let's say you think that it's too expensive. Well, that's about PBC. And if just because you think something is great to do and there's lots of support for it, if you think it's too expensive to do, you're not doing it, right? So people think it's great to go to school, to finish college. Everyone thinks you should be finishing college, but you just can't afford it. And so that may be the deciding factor. Another example would be stopping smoking, right? I think it's bad for me, right? You understand all the negative consequences of smoking. It would mean a lot to people I love. That is to say, if you quit smoking, right, it would mean a lot of people you love. So there's a strong subjective norm encouraging you to stop smoking. But you think it's too hard. And so you can see how no matter how bad you think smoking is for you and how much you know people are there for you, if you believe it's just too hard to do, you're never going to do it. So PBC is actually pretty important. So let's look at some sample survey items for PBC. First, we're going to talk about control beliefs, those things that are external to us. Using the condom example that I've used before, we'll ask a person about their access to condoms, right? Is it convenient or is it inconvenient? So access to condoms is inconvenient. And a person scores this on a scale from 1 to 7. I know usually the first one is usually -3 to +3. Here we usually do 1 to 7. So access to condoms is inconvenient. And you can think about especially a teenager who, say 15 years old, who doesn't drive, who maybe does not live convenient, it's not convenient for them to get even to, say, a convenience store, right? So accessing condoms may not be convenient. So access to condoms is inconvenient. And so you could see, right, maybe somebody who is 15 years old, they might say, yeah, I don't live near a store. I don't often have the ability to sort of be out and about on foot. I don't always have people take me places where I can get into a store and buy them myself. And so a person may consider the access to condoms inconvenient. Now that maybe the parents have sort of supplied them in the house and a person could go into them and they might see it as being more convenient, right? And by the way, some of you are surprised by that. That is actually advice that some health educators give, is that parents should provide condoms in a place in the home, not the child's room necessarily, but just in a place. And the parent said, I'm just going to leave some in there. And if it's ever low, you just mention it to me, but I'm not going to go into account. Just a little random FYI from some sexual health educators. Just sharing. Okay, anyway. So the person will says that 6. So it's often inconvenient, right? It's always, access condoms is always inconvenient. To give that a 6 out of 7, right? Perceived power. If I don't have a condom, I will avoid having sex, right? Now what we want to find out is, does that barrier affect you engaging in the behavior? So if you can't access a condom, is that going to lead you to avoid having sex? And a person is going to say either they strongly disagree or they strongly agree. So if a person says, right, that yes, that they're, as we point out up here, right, that their access to condoms is often inconvenient, and if I don't have a condom, I will avoid having sex. If the person says, oh, that's true, right, they says, yeah, really, if I don't have a condom, I'm probably going to avoid having sex. Well, those two numbers together, right, that's a 12, and that indicates they probably are going to be they're pretty good at safe sex practices, right? It's a positive 12. It could have been a 21. That's pretty good. But if by contrast, if I take those numbers away, if a person says, if I don't have a condom, I'll avoid having sex, probably not. I'll probably still have sex anyway. Well, now we're looking at a negative 12, right? And so we're seeing that this person, if there's a barrier that does not, they don't see that as a barrier that prevents them from engaging in that particular behavior, right? And then with our recycling example, we have control beliefs. I have a hard time finding recycling bins for water bottles, right? So how often do you have a hard time finding them? Never or always. I will admit, this question, this negative wording, could be a little tricky. So negative wording are not always a good idea, but we do see this happen a little more often in PBC for some reason, but you want clear wording. Anyway, I have a hard time finding recycling bins for water bottles. I never have a hard time, I always have a hard time. And then perceived power. If I cannot find a recycling bin, I'll keep my water bottle until I can recycle it. So we're asking, do you have the power to overcome this barrier? Strongly disagree, strongly agree. So in my case, I don't drink as much water as I drink Pepsi, which is a discussion for another time about bad habits and bad behaviors. And when I go to my mom's, I often visit my mom, I often have a Pepsi. It's what I need to get through the visit. Actually, I'm kidding. My mom's fine. Anyway, my mother does not recycle. Right? Also, in her defense, she doesn't drink any. She rarely has any aluminum cans or plastic bottles. She doesn't have a whole lot she would recycle, truth be told. Anyway, so, but do I have a hard time finding recycling bins for water bottles or recycling bins for, say, Pepsi? Not really. I don't really have that hard of a time. But if I can't find a place to recycle a can, like I'm at my mom's, am I likely to put the can in my car and take it home with me, where I do have a recycling bin, or am I likely just to put it in the trash can at my mom's? Well, if I cannot find a recycling bin, I'll keep it with me until I can recycle it. Yeah, I'm going to sort of slightly disagree, I'm afraid, right? So that's a score of a -2, right? So even though, look up here, isn't this sad? Even though I don't have that hard of a time, can you never find a recycling bin? Not really, right? Even though I don't have that hard of a time, I still not necessarily going to recycle, right? Even when there's a low barrier, I may not overcome that barrier. It's a -2, which means it's not on the positive side, right? There's a negative support for recycling. By contrast, my friend Loretta, right? We could look at her. I remember being when we were at LSU together and we ate lunch together most days there in the break room at work. There were not very many recycling bins around on campus at all. This was a while ago. And so I have a hard time finding recycling bins. Yeah, there weren't recycling bins around, so she would often have a hard time finding recycling bins. But when she finished her Pepsi after having lunch, she would put it into her bag and take it home with her to recycle it at home. So you put her numbers together, right? She is a positive 18. And you see what's important here, right? You see what's going on here? She was a 6, meaning often could not find a recycling bin, but yet she was willing to overcome it. I am pathetic, right? Because even though I often can find a recycling bin, if I can't find one, my motivation to overcome it is low, right? So she demonstrates that she has the power and the willingness to overcome her barrier. So she's a strong recycler. I am a pathetic recycler. If we look at this on the chart talking about texting and driving, we have talking about expectations, pulling over, and traffic. And what I mean by that, right, expectation is the expectation of other people that you'll reply to their text immediately, right? We have your likelihood of pulling over, right? You get a text or you want to send a text when you're driving, you could pull over, right? And then we're also looking at traffic. How does traffic affect whether you text and drive? So in this case, the person believes there's a very high expectation, it's a 7 out of 7, that from other people that they should reply to texts immediately. And then for pulling over, maybe we ask somebody it is about how inconvenient it is, right? 1 would be not inconvenient, 7 being very inconvenient to pull over, right? And this person is saying it'd be very inconvenient to pull over just to send a text. And we ask about traffic. How bad is or how much does traffic affect the sort of likelihood of sending a text? And they give it a 3. So yeah, the traffic usually isn't so bad that they can't send a text. It is sometimes, but not usually. So how do they feel about those things? Well, we might then ask them, strongly agree, strongly disagree. I feel the need to meet people's expectations for immediate reply of text messages. That's a positive 3, right? And then -3 to positive 3, agreeing with the statement, but it's going to be too difficult for me to pull over. And they say, yeah, it really is going to be too difficult for me to pull over. It's a positive 3, right? And then about whether or not does traffic make it harder or easier to text? And they say, well, it makes it a little bit harder to text. What we see then, right, in this example, is that expectation, right, the expectation from people to send an immediate reply is maxing out. It is, right, out of the possible scores, it's a 21. It is totally encouraging them to send a reply, right? Because pulling over is so difficult, right? Because it's so difficult, they're likely to text and drive because they're not likely to pull over. It's a 21. And traffic, if there's traffic out, that may slow a person down from reaching for their phone to text. And that gives us a total when we add all those up, where we add them all up, it gives us a total depressing score of 38 out of 63, which is a fairly decent support then for this person texting and driving, largely because they see pulling over as a ridiculous option, and they also feel compelled to meet people's expectations for immediate replies. So now what to do with all this information? Well, as before, we can identify areas for change. So in terms of control belief, the other person believed that there was a very strong expectation that for other people for them to reply to other people's texts, and they felt strongly compelled that they had to do it. They didn't feel they had to. They did not feel they had the power to say no to a person, right? If people expect immediate reply, I will text back even if I'm driving, right? So this is a person saying, if there's a barrier, or if other people want me to do something, if it's a barrier to me engaging in positive behaviors of not texting and driving, no. Because other people so strongly expect it from them, they feel they are powerless to other people's expectations, right? That's the key there, right? Other people strongly expect it, and they agree that they are going to comply with other people's expectations, right? That's a statement about how much power they think they have. They don't think they can say no to other people. That's why we got that 21, right? When we chart it out then, right, they're maxing out on that chart. And so what we can do, again, we can change the barriers to control. We could actually engage in a campaign that helps people to, first off, change what they perceive as others' expectations, but also a campaign that says, don't be so impatient, right? Don't be so impatient. Care more about their life than your time, right? And that would be a way of perhaps changing control beliefs. And sometimes in research, as part of change, as opposed to engaging in an actual persuasive campaign, they'll do something to remove barriers. So if we talk about the condom example, for instance, when teens feel they don't have convenient access to condoms, this is why then some state health departments will provide condoms to schools, right, in high school, so students will have more convenient access to them. Right, that's not really so much as a persuasive message campaign. That's a campaign that's about removing a barrier. Right, so the control belief often we don't always engage in through persuasive messages, but through a policy change to then make somebody's likelihood of engaging in behavior more likely or more possible. Right. We could also change a person's sense of power. Think about all those anti-smoking campaigns or those quit smoking campaigns that say things like, "You can quit smoking, we can help." Right? They're trying to give you an increased sense of power. And so if we tell people, right, to get them to not text and drive, right, that you have the power to say no. You can decide that your safety is more important than their impatience, right? Those sorts of messages would be ways of trying to change a person's sense of power. So TPB, the theory of planned behavior, right, not perceived behavioral control, but TPB in sum, what do we have? Well, in the theory of reasoned action, which is TRA, we had attitude toward behavior and subjective norm, and both of those together predicted behavioral intention. And now in TPB, we're adding this element of PBC, right? We're adding in perceived behavioral control, and that is what predicts behavior. So theory of reasoned action versus theory of planned behavior, is one sort of better than the other? Well, it's about the impact of PBC, perceived behavioral control. In short, the impact is huge, and I mean huge. It's a huge impact. Often it is the decisive factor. We still should look at attitudes. We still should look at subjective norms, because sometimes those are very important. But most often we see, so not always, but most often we see the perceived behavioral control is the deciding factor. But research shows us that when perceived behavioral control is usually high for everyone, right? If everybody feels they do have good control over something, smoking is not a good example of that. People often feel powerless to their addiction, right? But if people feel they have good control over something, then it's going to matter less. So let me tell you what I'm talking about here. A study done by, ironically, someone named Parks on driving dangerously, right? Parks, parking, cars. Anyway, on Driving Dangerously said that everybody pretty much feels that they have strong control over whether or not they're going to drive dangerously. And that study, Driving Dangerously, had to do with driving too close, running through red lights, speeding. People felt like they had pretty strong control over that. Other people weren't controlling those behaviors, they were controlling it. So in that case, it was more about subjective norms. That was predictive because everybody feels equally that they have control over it, but then whether or not an individual is going to drive too close to another car or run through a red light, that was predicted more in that particular case. It was predicted more by what they thought other people's opinion was, right? Subjective norm. And a study by Adjison and Stone on looking at cheating on schoolwork, everybody pretty much agreed they have the choice of whether or not they're going to cheat, whether they're going to copy off of somebody next to them, whether they're going to buy a paper to submit as their own, right? They're going to collaborate in a way they shouldn't on a project. People felt, yes, they had absolute control over that. That was not predictive of who was going to cheat and who wasn't. In that case, it had to do with what people saw as the outcome of the behavior, right? And that has to do with attitudes. If people thought they were likely to get caught and getting caught would be bad, then they wouldn't cheat. If they thought they weren't going to get caught and getting caught wouldn't be bad, they're more likely to cheat, right? And there's some other factors as well about whether or not passing this class or getting a good grade in this class meant they could stay in their major, achieve career goals, and so forth. So in that case, attitude meant more. What I'm getting at here is that many times the power we have to engage in a behavior or perceived power to engage in a behavior is predictive of whether or not we engage in the behavior or not. But if everybody feels equally powerful in making that decision, it may be the outcomes of the behavior decide what we do, or it may be the subjective norms, sort of peer pressure or social conformity, is what decides whether or not we engage in that behavior. So in doing data analysis, right, we're going to look at the individual impact then of attitudes, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control. Right? Which one of those? The outcomes, the social support, or the sense of power? Which one of those is most likely to predict whether or not a person does something or not? Right? And again, it maybe supports them doing it or not support them. Which one is most impactful? Right? So it could be the concerns for others' opinion or the outcomes. Which one of those is more important in whether or not you decide to do something or not, to smoke or not? Is it the concerns about health, what makes you decide to smoke or not smoke, or fitting in with the crowd is what makes you decide to smoke or not smoke? Right? But also we're going to look at specific attitudes, subnorms, and PBCs, right? Specific elements. So does one outcome make more of a difference than others, right? So when I was a new driver, my parents told me I was not allowed to go a certain way, to make a certain left turn because it was very dangerous to see, and they were concerned to get into an accident. I was terribly afraid of getting into an accident, and I believed I had bad luck, and if I didn't listen to my parents, I was likely to get into an accident, right? So specifically, why was I listening to them? Because I believed the possibility of an accident was high, and that thing alone is what made me listen to my parents on this one thing, where to not make the left turn on the Fairfax because I was so afraid of getting into a car accident. That one specific outcome, right? Or is there a specific barrier, right, that leads to a person right, performing a behavior or not? So we find in terms of eating more healthy foods, people's access to healthy foods is a major issue, right? So we could look at multiple factors about, do you know how to prepare healthy food? Do you know what healthy food is? Do you have access to healthy food? And it may be the last one. It may be that they don't have the access to the food. That barrier alone is what's affecting their choice to not eat more healthy food, right? We're going to talk about all this later, and we're going to talk about this much more. But for right now, this is the theory of planned behavior. You've survived these 4 lectures. Congratulations.